They left me bleeding on a hospital gurney, claiming they had more important things to do than wait around. My own family walked out while I was fighting for my life. 5 years later, they're standing outside my glass penthouse, tears streaming down their faces, begging me to let them back in. But they have no idea what I've become or how I got here. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. The fluorescent lights above my hospital bed flickered like a dying heartbeat, casting shadows that danced across the sterile white walls of Denver General Hospital. I could taste blood in my mouth, metallic and thick, while the steady beeping of machines filled the silence around me. My ribs felt like someone had taken a sledgehammer to them, and every breath sent shooting pains through my chest. "Alice, honey, we really need to get going," my stepmother, Margaret Davis, said, her voice carrying that familiar tone of barely concealed irritation. She stood at the foot of my bed, checking her rose gold watch for the third time in 10 minutes. Her perfectly manicured nails drummed against her designer purse, a nervous habit that always surfaced when she was uncomfortable. My half-sister Jessica shifted from foot to foot near the window, scrolling through her phone with practiced disinterest. At 19, she had mastered the art of looking busy whenever family drama unfolded. "Mom, the party starts at 8 and I still need to get ready," she whined, not even glancing up from her screen. Dad sat in the corner chair, his face buried in his hands. Robert Davis had always been a man of few words, but his silence felt different tonight. Heavier, more final. When he finally looked up, his eyes held something I'd never seen before: resignation. "The doctor said you're stable now, Alice," he said quietly, his voice barely audible over the monitor's persistent beeping. "The internal bleeding has stopped and they've got you on pain medication." I wanted to laugh, but it hurt too much. Stable. That's what they were calling this, my broken ribs. The concussion that made the room spin every time I turned my head, and the deep gashes on my arms from the car accident that had brought me here 6 hours ago. A drunk driver had slammed into my Honda Civic at the intersection of 5th and Main, sending me spinning into a traffic light pole. "But I just woke up," I managed to whisper, my throat raw from the breathing tube they'd removed earlier. "The nurse said I need to stay for observation." Margaret's expression hardened, and she exchanged a meaningful look with my father. It was the same look I'd seen countless times over the past 3 years since they'd married. The look that said I was an inconvenience, a complication in their otherwise perfect life. "We've already been here all day, Alice," Margaret said, her voice taking on that patronizing tone she used whenever she wanted to sound reasonable. "Jessica has her homecoming party tonight, and your father has that important client dinner tomorrow morning. We can't just sit around indefinitely." The words hit me harder than the impact from the accident. I'd always known I was the odd one out in this family. The reminder of my father's first marriage. The daughter from before. But I never imagined they'd actually abandon me in a hospital bed. "What about Grandma Helen?" I asked desperately, grasping for any lifeline. "She could stay with me, or—" "Helen is in Phoenix visiting your Aunt Carol," Dad interrupted, still not meeting my eyes. "Look, sweetheart, the doctor said you're going to be fine. The hospital staff will take good care of you and we'll pick you up tomorrow afternoon." Tomorrow afternoon, 16 hours away, assuming they actually remembered to come back. Jessica finally looked up from her phone, and for a moment, I thought I saw a flicker of sympathy in her eyes. But it vanished as quickly as it appeared, replaced by the same indifferent expression she'd worn since walking into my hospital room. "Besides," Margaret added, shouldering her purse with an air of finality, "you're 23, Alice. You're not a child anymore. You can handle one night alone." The irony wasn't lost on me. When it came to family decisions, career choices, or anything else that mattered, I was always too young and inexperienced to have an opinion. But now, lying broken in a hospital bed, I was suddenly mature enough to fend for myself. A nurse appeared in the doorway, her scrubs decorated with cheerful cartoon characters that seemed grotesquely out of place. "Visiting hours end in 15 minutes, she announced gently, her eyes taking in the scene with professional understanding. Margaret seized the opportunity like a drowning woman grabbing a life preserver. Perfect timing, she said brightly, leaning down to give me the most perfunctory kiss on the forehead I'd ever received. Her lips barely touched my skin, and she was already pulling away before the gesture was complete. "We'll see you tomorrow, honey," Dad said, finally approaching my bedside. For a moment, I thought he might reconsider, might pull up that chair and settle in for the night like any father should. Instead, he patted my hand twice. Quick, efficient pats that felt more like checking off a box than showing affection. Jessica offered a small wave without looking up from her phone. "Feel better, Alice," she mumbled, the words automatic and empty, and then they were gone. The silence that followed their departure was deafening. I stared at the doorway where my family had been standing moments before, half expecting one of them to return, to say they'd changed their minds. But the only sounds were the distant chatter of nurses at their station and the relentless beeping of my heart monitor. The nurse who'd announced visiting hours returned with a small cup of pills. "For the pain," she explained kindly, helping me sit up enough to swallow them. "Try to get some rest, hun. The night shift will keep an eye on you." Her name tag read Sandy Martinez, and she had kind eyes that crinkled at the corners. She was probably someone's mother, someone's wife, someone who would never dream of leaving a family member alone in a hospital bed. "Thank you," I whispered, my voice breaking slightly on the words. Sandy squeezed my shoulder gently. "You've got my call button right here if you need anything. Anything at all, okay?" After she left, I lay in the darkness listening to the sounds of the hospital around me. Somewhere down the hall, a woman was crying. In the next room, I could hear the low murmur of family members talking quietly among themselves. Normal families. Families who stayed. The pain medication began to take effect, making my thoughts fuzzy around the edges. But one thought remained crystal clear, burning through the haze like a beacon. I was completely, utterly alone. My phone lay on the bedside table, its screen dark and silent. No concerned text messages, no calls to check on me, nothing. I picked it up with trembling fingers and scrolled through my contacts, looking for someone, anyone who might care that I was lying broken in a hospital bed. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. The list was depressingly short. A few college acquaintances who I hadn't spoken to in months. My old roommate who'd moved to Seattle. Some co-workers from the coffee shop where I worked part-time while taking night classes for my accounting degree. None of them felt like the kind of person you'd call in a crisis. That's when it hit me. The devastating realization that my family wasn't just absent from my hospital bed. They'd been absent from my life for years. I'd been so busy trying to earn their love, their approval, their simple acknowledgement, that I'd never noticed how isolated I'd become. As the night wore on and the hospital settled into its quiet rhythm, something shifted inside me. The pain medication couldn't touch this new ache, the deep, burning awareness that I'd been living my entire adult life trying to matter to people who had already decided I didn't. When I finally drifted off to sleep near dawn, my dreams were filled not with fear or sadness, but with a strange sense of clarity. Sometimes I thought as consciousness slipped away, the most painful moments are also the most illuminating. I had no way of knowing that this night, this abandonment, would become the catalyst for everything that followed. But even then, somewhere in the medicated haze of pain and betrayal, a small flame of determination began to flicker to life. They'd left me alone to prove I didn't matter. They had no idea how wrong they were about to be. 3 days passed before anyone came to get me. 3 days of watching other patients receive flowers, visitors, and concerned phone calls while my bedside table remained empty, except for a plastic water pitcher and the TV remote that barely worked. Dr. Patricia Wong, the attending physician, had been making increasingly uncomfortable expressions during her morning rounds. On Wednesday, she finally pulled up the chair my father had vacated and sat down with the kind of serious expression that usually preceded bad news. "Alice, I need to ask you something. And I want you to be honest with me," she said, her voice gentle but firm. Is there a reason your family hasn't been back to see you? The question hung in the air like smoke from a fire I couldn't put out. I could have lied, made excuses, protected their image the way I'd been doing my entire adult life. Instead, I found myself telling her the truth. They had other plans, I said simply. Dr. Wong's eyebrows rose slightly. She was probably in her 40s, with graying hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and the kind of direct gaze that suggested she'd seen enough human behavior to surprise her very little. But even she seemed taken aback by this revelation. Other plans, she repeated slowly. My half-sister's homecoming party. My father's client's dinner. Important things. The silence that followed was more eloquent than any response could have been. Dr. Wong made a note in my chart, and I caught a glimpse of her handwriting. The patient appears to have a limited family support system. Limited. That was one way to put it. When she finally discharged me Thursday afternoon, I took a taxi home to the small apartment I rented in the Riverside district. The building was old but clean, with thin walls and a view of the parking lot behind a Chinese restaurant. I'd chosen it because the rent was cheap enough for me to afford while working part-time and taking evening classes. At Denver Community College, my phone had exactly 0 missed calls. The apartment felt different when I walked through the door. Everything was exactly as I'd left it. My textbook stacked on the kitchen table, my work uniform hanging on the bedroom door, the half-empty coffee cup I'd abandoned when the ambulance arrived. But somehow it all felt like artifacts from someone else's life. I spent the next week moving carefully around my space, my ribs still tender and my head occasionally swimming with residual dizziness. The coffee shop where I worked, Grind Time, had replaced me with a high school kid who could work more hours anyway. My manager, Kevin Patterson, had the decency to look embarrassed when he told me over the phone. "It's just temporary, Alice," he said, though we both knew it wasn't. "Until you're back to full strength." Full strength. Another euphemism for something that wouldn't be coming back. But the strangest thing happened during those quiet days of recovery. Without the constant noise of trying to please people who would never be pleased, I started thinking clearly for the first time in years. I pulled out my laptop and began researching something I'd been putting off for months, starting my own bookkeeping business. I'd always been good with numbers. It was the one thing that made sense to me in a world where family dynamics and social relationships felt like puzzles missing half their pieces. Numbers didn't lie, didn't play favorites, and didn't abandon you when something more interesting came along. The math was actually encouraging. With my associate's degree in accounting nearly complete and the bookkeeping certification I'd earned last year, I could realistically start taking on small business clients. The startup costs were minimal, just software, a decent computer, and business cards. I had exactly $3,047 in my savings account. It wasn't much, but it was mine. On Sunday, exactly 1 week after the accident, my phone finally rang. Margaret's name appeared on the screen, and for a moment I hesitated. Part of me wanted to let it go to voicemail, to maintain the blessed silence that had become my new normal. But I answered. "Alice, honey, how are you feeling?" Margaret's voice was bright with artificial cheer, the tone she used when she wanted something. "We've been so worried about you." Worried. They'd been worried for 7 days without picking up a phone. "I'm fine," I said, my voice flat. Good, good. Listen, sweetheart. I know we had to rush out of the hospital, but you understand how it is. Jessica's homecoming was such a big deal for her, and your father's client dinner ended up being worth nearly $50,000 in new contracts. She waited for me to congratulate them, to express understanding, to play my usual role as the accommodating daughter who never caused trouble. Instead, I said nothing. The silence stretched until Margaret cleared her throat nervously. "Anyway, we wanted to invite you to Sunday dinner this week. Make up for lost time, you know. I'm making that pot roast you like." I didn't like pot roast. I'd told her this at least 6 times over the past 3 years, but she never remembered. It was Jessica who liked pot roast. "I can't make it," I said. "Oh, well, what about next Sunday then?" "I can't make that either." Another pause, longer this time. When Margaret spoke again, Her voice had lost some of its artificial warmth. "Alice, I hope you're not holding a grudge about the hospital situation. We're family, and families forgive each other. Family." The word felt strange in my mouth now, like a piece of clothing that no longer fit. "I'm not holding a grudge," I said. Which was true. A grudge implied I still expected something from them. "I'm just busy." "Busy with what?" "Kevin said you're not working at the coffee shop anymore." The fact that she'd called Kevin to check up on me should have felt caring, but instead it felt intrusive. Like surveillance rather than concern. "I'm starting my own business," I said. Margaret laughed, a sharp, dismissive sound. "Oh, Alice, you know your father and I think it's wonderful that you have hobbies, but you can't just quit your job every time something gets difficult. That's not how the real world works, hobbies." She'd called my career plans a hobby. "I have to go," I said. "Alice, wait." I hung up. The phone rang again immediately, but I turned it off and set it in a drawer. The silence that followed felt different from the hospital silence. Not empty, but full of possibility. That night, I created my business plan. Not a vague dream or a someday maybe fantasy, but an actual plan with timelines, financial projections, and actionable steps. I researched business licenses, designed a simple website, and wrote up service packages for different types of clients. By midnight, Brown Financial Services existed on paper. By the end of the week, it would exist in reality. I started small, a food truck owner who needed help organizing his receipts, a freelance photographer who was drowning in expense reports, a small bakery whose owner was brilliant with pastries but hopeless with payroll. I charged reasonable rates and delivered exceptional work, staying up late to ensure every number was perfect. Every report was clear and professional. Word spread quietly through Denver's small business community. The food truck owner recommended me to his supplier. The photographer mentioned me to her wedding planner friend. The bakery owner connected me with 3 other restaurant owners who needed bookkeeping help. Within 2 months, I was making more money than I'd ever earned at the coffee shop, working from my apartment and setting my own schedule. The broken ribs healed completely. The headaches stopped. But the most significant change was internal, a growing sense that I was finally living my own life rather than trying to fit into someone else's. My family's silence became my freedom, and I was just getting started. By spring, I'd outgrown my apartment. Not just physically, though the dining table covered with client files and the second laptop I'd bought definitely made the space feel cramped, but mentally. The walls that had once felt like a safe cocoon now reminded me daily of how small I'd been thinking. My client roster had grown to 23 businesses, ranging from food trucks to a small law firm that specialized in personal injury cases. The attorney, Marcus Rodriguez, had been particularly impressed with my work. Reorganizing 5 years of chaotic financial records his previous bookkeeper had left behind, "You saved me about $30,000 in potential audit penalties," he told me during our quarterly review meeting at his downtown office. "Have you ever considered expanding? Maybe hiring some help?" The question had been lurking in the back of my mind for weeks. I was working 12-hour days and still having to turn away potential clients. But expansion meant investment, risk, and a level of commitment that felt simultaneously thrilling and terrifying. "I've been thinking about it," I admitted, closing his quarterly report and sliding it across his polished conference table. Marcus leaned back in his chair, studying me with the same intensity he probably used in courtrooms. "You know, my wife owns a commercial real estate company. There's a small office space in the Riverside Financial Building that might be perfect for someone just starting to scale up." The Riverside Financial Building. I knew it well, a sleek glass structure that housed several accounting firms, wealth management companies, and financial consultants. The kind of place where serious business happened. 2 days later, I was standing in an 800-square-foot office on the building's 3rd floor, looking out at a view of downtown Denver that made my apartment's parking lot vista seem like a distant memory. The space was empty except for built-in bookshelves and a small reception area, but I could envision exactly how it would look, filled with desks, filing cabinets, and maybe even an employee or 2. The lease was more money than I'd ever committed to anything in my life, but the numbers worked. Barely, but they worked. I signed the papers that afternoon. Setting up the office took 3 weeks of 16-hour days. I bought furniture from estate sales and clearance outlets, painted the reception area a calming sage green, and invested in professional accounting software that could handle multiple clients simultaneously. The biggest purchase was a used Herman Miller desk that had belonged to a bankruptcy attorney. Somehow, that felt appropriately symbolic. Lisa Chen became my first employee entirely by accident. She was a recent college graduate who'd been temping at various accounting firms around the city. And she showed up one morning to interview for what she thought was a position with the wealth management company next door. She'd gotten off the elevator on the wrong floor. "I'm so sorry," she said, standing in my doorway with a resume in hand and looking mortified. "I thought this was Pinnacle Wealth Management." "Common mistake," I said, glancing up from the payroll reports I'd been reviewing. "They're on the 5th floor." But something about her made me pause. Maybe it was the way she didn't immediately rush off in embarrassment, or how her eyes took in my office setup with genuine interest rather than the slightly condescending assessment I'd grown used to from people who thought small businesses were just hobbies. "What kind of work do you do here?" she asked. 15 minutes later, I was offering her a position I hadn't even known I wanted to create. Lisa turned out to be exactly what Brown Financial Services needed. She had a knack for client communication that complemented my technical skills perfectly, and she brought fresh ideas about marketing and business development that I never would have considered. Within a month, she'd created a social media presence for the company and designed a client referral program that brought in 6 new accounts. The growth was exhilarating and exhausting. By summer, we'd moved to a larger office in the same building and hired a part-time administrative assistant named David Patel, a methodical perfectionist who could organize filing systems with the precision of a Swiss watchmaker. But the real turning point came in August, when Marcus Rodriguez referred me to his biggest client, Richardson Manufacturing, a mid-sized company that produced custom metal fixtures for commercial construction. Their CFO had just retired, leaving behind a financial mess that would have made my early client files look organized by comparison. Tom Richardson, the company's owner, was a bear of a man with calloused hands and a direct way of speaking that I found refreshing after months of corporate doublespeak from some of my larger clients. "I'll be honest with you, Alice," he said during our initial consultation at his warehouse facility. "I built this company from nothing, but numbers have never been my strong suit. My wife used to handle the books, but she passed away 2 years ago. And since then," he gestured helplessly at a stack of boxes filled with invoices, receipts, and bank statements. The project took 3 months to complete. Lisa and I worked with David to create systems that Richardson could maintain going forward. And I personally trained Tom's daughter, Rebecca, who'd recently joined the family business, on the new procedures. When we finished, Richardson Manufacturing's books were cleaner than they'd been in a decade. More importantly, our work had uncovered nearly $80,000 in unclaimed vendor credits and identified several tax deductions Tom had been missing for years. "You didn't just save my business," Tom told me when I presented the final report. "You probably saved my sanity." The Richardson Project established Brown Financial Services as more than just another small bookkeeping company. Word spread through Denver's manufacturing community, and suddenly I was getting calls from business owners who'd heard about the young woman who worked miracles with messy books. By the end of my 2nd year in business, I had 11 employees working out of a full floor of the Riverside Financial Building. We'd handled over 200 clients, from solo entrepreneurs to companies with annual revenues in the millions. The scared, abandoned woman in the hospital bed felt like a character from someone else's story. But success brought its own challenges. The bigger we grew, the more visible we became. Local business journals started writing articles about Denver's rising financial services star. The Denver Chamber of Commerce invited me to speak at their annual small business luncheon. A regional accounting magazine featured Brown Financial Services in their Companies to Watch section, and that's when my family started paying attention. The first sign came in October, a friend request on Facebook from Jessica. I hadn't used the platform in months, but the notification popped up on my phone while I was reviewing quarterly reports with Lisa. "Everything okay?" Lisa asked, noticing my expression. I stared at Jessica's profile picture, her in a homecoming dress, the same party they'd left the hospital to attend 2 years earlier. "Just someone from my past," I said, declining the request and putting my phone away, but it wouldn't be the last attempt at contact. A week later, Margaret called the office. David transferred the call to me, announcing that Margaret Davis was on line 1, asking to speak with me about family business. I stared at the blinking light on my phone for a full 30 seconds before picking up. "Alice?" Margaret's voice was different, smaller somehow, less commanding than I remembered. "Hi, Margaret. Well, I saw the article about your company in Colorado Business Weekly. We all did. We're so proud of you, honey." "Proud." The word landed like a stone in still water, creating ripples I could feel but couldn't quite name. "Thank you," I said simply. "Maybe we could get together. Catch up? It's been too long since we've seen you. 2 years, 3 months, and 6 days, to be exact. But I didn't say that." "I'm pretty busy these days, Margaret." The silence stretched between us like a bridge neither of us wanted to cross first. "Of course you are," she finally said. "You're such a success now. We always knew you would be." After I hung up, I sat in my office looking out at the city skyline, trying to remember if they'd ever said anything like that before. The memory banks came up empty. They always knew I would be successful. Funny how they'd kept that knowledge to themselves when I needed it most. The penthouse wasn't something I'd planned. When my real estate agent, Sarah Kim, first mentioned the property in the Millennium Tower, I'd actually laughed out loud. "Sarah, I'm looking for a nice 2-bedroom condo. Not a movie set," I told her over coffee at our usual meeting spot downtown. But she was persistent. The way good real estate agents always are when they sense opportunity. "Just look at it. Alice, the owner, is motivated to sell. He's relocating to Singapore for work and needs to close quickly. The price is actually reasonable for what you get." Reasonable turned out to be $2.8 million for 3,200 square feet of glass, steel, and breathtaking views of the Rocky Mountains. The penthouse occupied the entire top floor of Denver's most exclusive residential building, complete with a private elevator, floor-to-ceiling windows, and a terrace that wrapped around 3 sides of the unit. Standing in that empty space for the first time, looking out over a city where I'd once felt so small and invisible, something shifted inside me. This wasn't just about having a nice place to live. This was about claiming space in a world that had spent years telling me I didn't belong. I made an offer that afternoon. The purchase closed 2 weeks before Christmas, and I spent the holidays furnishing my new home with the kind of deliberate care I'd never been able to afford before. Everything was chosen for quality and comfort rather than price. A handcrafted dining table from a local artisan, a sectional sofa soft enough to sleep on, and a home office with custom built-ins for my growing collection of business books and industry awards. The master bedroom featured a walk-in closet larger than my first apartment's living room, and the kitchen had professional-grade appliances I was still learning to use. But my favorite feature was the library. A small room with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves and a reading chair positioned to catch the morning light streaming through the eastern windows. Meanwhile, Brown Financial Services had evolved into something I barely recognized from its humble beginnings. We now employed 26 people across 3 departments: traditional bookkeeping, financial consulting, and a new audit preparation service that had quickly become our most profitable division. The audit prep service had been Lisa's brainchild. She'd noticed how many of our clients struggled when facing IRS audits or compliance reviews, and suggested we offer specialized support for these high-stress situations. Within 6 months, we were handling audit preparations for companies across Colorado and neighboring states. Our biggest coup came in February when we landed Pinnacle Healthcare Group as a client, the same company whose wealth management neighbor had led to Lisa's accidental hiring. Pinnacle operated 12 medical facilities across the region, and their financial complexity required us to create entirely new systems and protocols. The project put Brown Financial Services on the map in a way that previous successes hadn't. Healthcare. Finance was notoriously complicated, involving insurance reimbursements, government regulations, and multiple revenue streams that changed constantly. Successfully managing Pinnacle's books positioned us as experts in one of the most challenging sectors of the business world. Industry recognition followed quickly. I was invited to speak at the Colorado Association of CPAs annual conference about innovative approaches to healthcare financial management. The Denver Business Journal named Brown Financial Services their Small Business of the Year. Most significantly, we received a contract offer from the state of Colorado to help streamline financial reporting for small municipalities, a project worth nearly $500,000 annually. But success at this level came with unexpected challenges. The bigger we grew, the more complex our own internal operations became. I found myself spending less time with actual numbers and more time managing people, negotiating contracts, and making strategic decisions about the company's future direction. That's when I hired Victoria Walsh as our Chief Operating Officer, a decision that would prove crucial in the months ahead. Victoria had 20 years of experience growing financial services companies, including 2 successful exits where she'd helped founders sell their businesses for substantial profits. She was sharp, strategic, and had the kind of operational expertise that allowed me to focus on client relationships and business development. "You've built something remarkable here, Alice," she told me during our first quarterly review meeting in my Penthouse home office. "But you're at a crossroads. You can either scale systematically or risk growing too fast and losing control." Her advice was to slow down our client acquisition and focus on optimizing our existing operations. It felt counterintuitive, turning away business, when we were riding such a high wave of success, but the numbers supported her recommendation. We implemented new systems for everything from client onboarding to employee performance reviews. Victoria restructured our departments to eliminate redundancies and improve communication flow. Most importantly, she helped me transition from being the person who did everything to being the person who ensured everything got done properly. The transformation took 8 months, but the results were dramatic. Our profit margins increased by 35% while our error rates dropped to nearly 0. Client satisfaction scores reached the highest levels we'd ever recorded. And perhaps most personally satisfying, I was no longer working 16-hour days just to keep up with demand, which gave me time to notice that my family's attempts at contact were becoming more frequent and more desperate. Jessica had progressed from Facebook friend requests to Instagram follows to LinkedIn connection attempts. Margaret called the office monthly, each time with a different excuse. She'd heard about our healthcare contract, seen our business journal article, or wanted to invite me to some family celebration I'd never attended anyway. My father had even sent a card to the office for my birthday, something he'd never done during the years when we actually spoke regularly. The card featured a generic message about being proud of my accomplishments, signed simply Dad in his careful handwriting. But the most telling incident happened in June, when I attended a Chamber of Commerce networking event at the Denver Art Museum. I was talking with the director of a nonprofit that was considering our services when I spotted a familiar figure across the room. Margaret was there, wearing a black cocktail dress I didn't recognize and chatting animatedly with several people I knew from the local business community. She wasn't a member of the Chamber of Commerce, and she certainly wasn't involved in Denver's nonprofit sector. She was there looking for me. Our eyes met across the crowded reception area, and I watched her excuse herself from her conversation and begin walking in my direction. For a moment, I considered staying to see what she would say, but something about the determination in her stride made me change my mind. I politely ended my conversation with the nonprofit director and slipped out through a side exit before Margaret could reach me. Later that evening, sitting on my penthouse terrace with a glass of wine and the city lights spread out below me, I realized that the dynamic had completely reversed. For the first time in my adult life, they were the ones seeking my attention, my approval, my presence in their lives, and for the first time, I held all the power to decide whether or not to give it to them. The irony was almost perfect. 3 years earlier, I would have done anything for a phone call, a dinner invitation, or even basic acknowledgement of my existence. Now that I no longer needed or wanted those things, they were suddenly eager to provide them. My phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "Alice, this is Jessica. I got your number from the business website. We really need to talk. It's important. Please call me." I stared at the message for a long moment, then deleted it without responding. Whatever they wanted to talk about, it could wait. I had built a life they couldn't abandon me from, success they couldn't diminish, and a future they couldn't control. And that was just the beginning. The Forbes article changed everything. I was reviewing quarterly projections with Victoria when Lisa knocked on my office door, holding her tablet with an expression of barely contained excitement. "Alice, you need to see this right now," she said, setting the device on my desk. The headline read, 30 Under 30, The Financial. Revolutionaries Reshaping America's Business Landscape. My photograph occupied the top right corner of the screen, a professional headshot taken during last month's industry conference. With the Denver skyline visible behind me, the article painted a picture of Brown Financial Services that felt almost surreal to read. We were described as a disruptive force in traditional accounting, and I was quoted alongside entrepreneurs who'd built companies worth hundreds of millions. The writer had somehow discovered details about our client retention rate, 98.7%, our year-over-year growth, 340%, and our innovative approach to healthcare financial management. "This is going to be everywhere," Victoria said, reading over my shoulder. "Forbes has serious reach. Expect your phone to start ringing within the hour." She was right. By lunch, I'd received calls from 3 different investment firms asking about acquisition opportunities, 2 headhunters trying to poach me for Fortune 500 companies, and a reporter from the Wall Street Journal wanting to do a follow-up feature. But the call that caught me off guard came at 4:30 p.m., just as I was preparing to leave for a client dinner. David transferred it to my office with an unusual note of concern in his voice. "Alice, there's a Robert Davis on line 2. He says he's your father and that it's urgent." I stared at the blinking light on my phone for nearly a minute before picking up. "Alice?" My father's voice was rougher than I remembered, strained in a way that immediately put me on alert. "Thank God you answered. I saw the Forbes article and, honey, I'm so proud of you." The words felt hollow, scripted. I waited for him to continue. "Listen, I know it's been a while since we've talked, but I need to see you. We all do. There's something important we need to discuss and it can't wait." "What kind of something?" A long pause. "It's about the family, Alice, about our future. Margaret thinks. We think it would be better to discuss this in person. Family, future, these were words that had lost their meaning years ago in a hospital room where visiting hours ended and I was left alone. I'm pretty busy these days. Dad, please, Alice, I know things haven't been perfect between us, but you're still my daughter and we need your help. Need. There it was, the real reason for his call, stripped of all pretense. Help with what? Another pause, longer this time. Financial trouble? Margaret's boutique hasn't been doing well, and Jessica's student loans are significant. We thought maybe, given your success. The request hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. My father, the man who'd left me bleeding in a hospital bed because his wife's party was more important, was asking me for money. How much? I asked, my voice steady despite the storm of emotions rising in my chest. Well, we were hoping. Maybe we could discuss a loan of sorts. Something temporary. Around $50,000 to start, just to get us back on our feet. $50,000. The amount was almost laughably small compared to the contracts I'd been negotiating lately, but that wasn't the point. The point was that they'd calculated my worth, determined what they thought they could extract, and wrapped their greed in the language of family obligation. I'll think about it, I said. Alice. Wait. I hung up. That evening, instead of attending the client dinner I'd planned, I found myself standing on my penthouse terrace, looking out over a city that had become the stage for my transformation. The Forbes article was already being shared across social media, tagged with phrases like inspiration and female entrepreneur goals. My LinkedIn profile had received over 200 new connection requests, but all I could think about was that phone call. They needed my help. After 3 years of silence, after abandoning me at my lowest point, after treating my dreams as hobbies and my success as surprising rather than inevitable, they needed something from me. The next morning brought a flood of congratulations from colleagues, clients, and business contacts who'd seen the Forbes piece. Tom Richardson called personally to tell me how proud he was to have been one of my early supporters. Marcus Rodriguez sent flowers to the office, with a note about watching greatness unfold, but mixed in with the professional accolades were messages from a past I'd almost forgotten existed. Margaret had somehow obtained my personal email address and sent a lengthy message detailing their financial challenges and how much they'd love to reconnect as a family. Jessica had found my penthouse address and sent a handwritten letter explaining her struggles. As a recent college graduate in a tough job market, even my father had sent a formal business proposal, actually formatted like a loan agreement, outlining repayment terms for the money he wanted. The audacity was breathtaking. They'd turned my success into their business opportunity, my achievement into their salvation. I was reviewing these messages for the third time when Victoria knocked on my door with an expression I'd never seen before. Part concern, part curiosity. "Alice, there are 3 people in the lobby asking to see you. They say they're family members and they don't have an appointment." My stomach dropped. "Did they give names?" "Robert Davis, Margaret Davis, and Jessica Davis. Should I have security escort them out?" I closed my laptop and stood up, smoothing my dress and checking my reflection in the office window. In the glass, I saw a woman I barely recognized from 4 years ago. Confident, professional, successful. The kind of person who commanded respect and had the power to make decisions that affected other people's lives. "No," I said finally. "Send them up to the conference room." "I'll see them." Victoria raised an eyebrow. "Are you sure?" "Absolutely." I gathered the printed copies of their emails and letters from my desk. After all this time, I think it's finally time for a family meeting. As I walked toward the conference room, I could feel the weight of their presence in the building. 3 people who'd shaped my understanding of worthlessness now sitting in the elegant space I'd created. Through sheer determination and skill, they wanted to reconnect. They needed my help. They were ready to be a family again. How convenient for them. The conference room doors were frosted glass, and through them I could see 3 silhouettes sitting at the polished table where I'd negotiated million-dollar contracts and planned expansion strategies. For a moment I paused with my hand on the door handle, remembering the last time I'd seen them, walking away from my hospital bed without looking back. Then I opened the door and stepped inside. "Hello," I said simply. "I believe you wanted to talk." The look of shock on their faces when they saw me, really saw me in my tailored suit and designer heels, standing in my own conference room in my own company, was worth every lonely night I'd spent building this life. But their shock was nothing. Compared to what I was about to tell them, the silence in the conference room stretched for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. My father, Margaret, and Jessica sat frozen around the polished table, their eyes taking in details they'd never bothered to notice before. The awards on the walls, the city view through floor-to-ceiling windows, the quiet hum of a business empire I'd built from nothing. Margaret was the first to recover, plastering on that familiar bright smile I remembered so well. "Alice, honey, look at all this," she said, gesturing around the room with forced enthusiasm. "We had no idea you'd become so successful. This is incredible." I took a seat at the head of the table, the same position I occupied during client meetings and board presentations. From here, I could see all 3 of them clearly, and they had to look up slightly to meet my eyes. "Thank you," I said simply. "Now, what exactly did you want to discuss?" Jessica shifted uncomfortably in her chair. She looked older than I remembered, with the kind of stress lines that come from financial pressure and uncertainty. Alice, we know it's been a while since we've talked. 3 years, 8 months, and 12 days, I interrupted quietly. Since you left me in the hospital? The words landed like physical blows. Margaret's smile faltered. Jessica looked down at her hands, and my father's face went pale. Alice, sweetheart, my father said, his voice carrying that same pleading tone from our phone conversation. We know we made mistakes. We were going through a difficult time as a family, and maybe we didn't handle things the best way. Difficult time? I repeated. Is that what we're calling it? Margaret leaned forward, trying to regain control of the conversation. What your father means is that we've all grown since then. We've learned to appreciate what really matters: family, relationships, supporting each other through challenges. I almost laughed at the irony. They'd learned to appreciate family support right around the time I no longer needed it from them. Let me guess, I said, pulling out the printed emails and letters they'd sent. The appreciation started when you saw the Forbes article. The color drained from Margaret's face as I spread their correspondence across the table like evidence in a criminal trial. Dad's formal loan proposal for $50,000. Margaret's detailed explanation of the boutique's financial problems. Jessica's handwritten plea about student loan debt. I looked up at each of them in turn. Very touching stuff. Really demonstrates that family appreciation you mentioned. Jessica finally looked up, and I was surprised to see tears in her eyes. Alice, I know how this looks, but we really do want to reconnect with you. Yes, we need help, but it's not just about money. Isn't it? I asked. Because I noticed none of you attempted this reconnection during the 2 years I was building this company. No congratulations when I landed my first major client. No how are you doing calls when I hired my first employee. The silence was deafening until my net worth became public knowledge. My father tried a different approach. Alice, I know I failed you. I know leaving you in that hospital was wrong. I've regretted it every day since then. Have you? I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the city where I'd rebuilt my entire life. Because your regret didn't inspire a single phone call, text message, or email until last month? We didn't know how to reach out, Margaret said weakly. We thought you might not want to hear from us. I turned back to face them. You were right. I didn't want to hear from you. I spent months wondering why my own family could abandon me when I needed them most. I blamed myself, thought I wasn't worthy of basic human decency. Do you know what that does to a person? The silence was absolute now. Even the building's air conditioning seemed to have quieted. But then something interesting happened, I continued. I stopped waiting for your approval, your love, your acknowledgement. I stopped trying to earn something that was never going to be freely given. And once I did that, I discovered something remarkable. I didn't actually need any of you. Jessica was crying openly now. Alice, please. We know we messed up. We want to make it right. Make it right? I walked back to the table but remained standing. How exactly do you plan to do that? With another dinner invitation I'll decline? Another family gathering where I'm the afterthought? We could be a real family, my father said desperately. Support each other, spend time together, be there for each other like families should. Like families should, I repeated slowly. Tell me, Dad, when exactly did you learn how families should behave? Was it before or after you calculated how much money you could ask me for? Margaret tried one last manipulation. Alice, honey, I know you're successful now, but success without family is empty. You need people who love you, people who were there from the beginning. The words were so perfectly wrong that I actually smiled. People who were there from the beginning, I said. You mean like when I was bleeding in a hospital bed and you left to attend a homecoming party? That kind of being there. I walked back to my chair and sat down, my decision crystallizing with perfect clarity. Here's what's going to happen, I said, my voice calm and professional. You're going to leave my office. You're going to stop calling, emailing, and showing up uninvited. You're going to go back to your lives and figure out your financial problems the same way I figured out mine, without family support. Alice, my father started. I'm not finished. My voice carried the authority I'd developed from years of running boardroom meetings. If you ever attempt to contact me again, if you try to use my success as a networking opportunity, if you show up at my events or my home, I will have you removed by security and, if necessary, pursue legal action for harassment." Jessica was sobbing now, and even Margaret's composure had cracked. But my father looked more shocked than devastated, as if he couldn't quite believe that the daughter he'd dismissed for so many years was now the one setting terms. "You can't mean that," he said. "We're family." I stood up and walked to the conference room door, holding it open. "No," I said quietly. "Family shows up when it matters. Family doesn't abandon you at your lowest point and then reappear when you're successful. What we are is biologically related strangers who share some unfortunate history." They filed out slowly, Margaret trying to maintain some dignity, Jessica still crying, and my father looking back as if he expected me to change my mind. When the door closed behind them, I stood alone in the conference room where I'd just severed the last ties to a family that had never truly existed. Through the frosted glass, I watched them wait for the elevator. Margaret was talking rapidly, probably strategizing their next approach. Jessica was wiping her eyes with tissues. My father stood with his shoulders slumped, looking older than I'd ever seen him. The elevator doors opened. They stepped inside and then they were gone. I walked back to my office, where Victoria was waiting with a concerned expression. "Everything okay?" she asked. I looked out at the city that had become my home, at the business I'd built from nothing, at the life I'd created entirely on my own terms. "Everything's perfect," I said. And for the first time in my adult life, I meant it. 3 months later, I was standing on my penthouse terrace, celebrating Brown Financial Services' acquisition by a national accounting firm for $47 million. The sale would allow me to expand into new markets while maintaining operational control of the company I'd built. Lisa raised her champagne glass in a toast. To Alice Brown, who proved that the best revenge is massive success. I smiled, looking out over the city lights that sparkled like stars beneath us. "It was never about revenge," I said. "It was about building a life they couldn't abandon me from." And that, I realized, was the sweetest victory of all. 6 months after cutting ties with my family, I received an unexpected call that would reshape everything I thought I knew about success and closure. I was in my penthouse office, reviewing the final details of a merger between two of our largest clients, when Victoria buzzed me from the main office downtown. "Alice, there's a woman here who says she's your grandmother." "Helen Brown?" "She doesn't have an appointment, but she's been waiting for 2 hours and refuses to leave." Grandma Helen, my father's mother. The one person in my family who'd ever seemed genuinely interested in my well-being before the accident. She'd been in Phoenix during my hospital stay, visiting my Aunt Carol, and I hadn't spoken to her since. "Send her up," I said. 20 minutes later, Helen Brown sat across from my dining table, looking remarkably unchanged despite being nearly 80. Her silver hair was still perfectly styled, her posture still regal, and her eyes still held the sharp intelligence that had always set her apart from the rest of the family. "You've done well for yourself, Alice," she said, accepting the coffee I'd prepared. "Though I suppose that's an understatement considering the circumstances." "What circumstances are those, Grandma?" She smiled, a knowing expression that suggested she understood far more than she'd initially let on. "The circumstances that led your father to show up at my door last week, crying like a 12-year-old boy who'd lost his bicycle." I set down my coffee cup with perhaps more force than necessary. "He came to see you?" "Oh, yes. Along with that wife of his and Jessica. Quite the delegation." Helen's tone carried the faint disapproval she'd never bothered to hide regarding Margaret. "They wanted me to intercede on their behalf. Apparently, they believe family pressure might succeed where direct appeals have failed." The audacity continued to amaze me. Even after our confrontation in the conference room, they were still strategizing, still looking for leverage points and new angles of approach. "And what did you tell them?" Helen took a deliberate sip of her coffee before answering. "I told them that if they'd wanted family loyalty, they should have shown some when it mattered." The words hit me with unexpected force. For 3 years, I'd wondered if I was overreacting, if my anger was disproportionate, if somehow I was the one who'd failed to understand family dynamics. But here was someone from that very family, someone who'd known all of us for decades, validating every feeling I'd wrestled with. "You knew?" I asked quietly. "About the hospital?" "I knew they'd left you alone, yes." Margaret couldn't resist mentioning how mature you'd been about understanding their prior commitments. Helen's expression hardened, as if abandoning a family member during a medical emergency was a sign of your character rather than theirs. I felt something release inside my chest, a tension I hadn't even realized I'd been carrying. I thought maybe I was being too harsh, that families are supposed to forgive and move forward. "Families are supposed to show up first," Helen said firmly. "Forgiveness comes after accountability, not instead of it." We sat in comfortable silence for a moment, both looking out at the city skyline that had become the backdrop for my transformation. "There's something else I need to tell you," Helen said eventually. "Something about why I'm really here." I waited. "I'm dying, Alice. Pancreatic cancer. The doctors give me maybe 6 months." The words hit like a physical blow. Despite everything that had happened with my family, Helen had always been different. The one person who'd remembered my birthday without being reminded, who'd asked about my dreams instead of dismissing them, who'd treated me like a person rather than an inconvenience. "Grandma, I'm so sorry. Is there anything I can do? Any treatment options we haven't explored?" She waved away my concern with the same gesture she'd used to dismiss my childhood worries about monsters under the bed. "I'm 81 years old, dear. I've had a good run. But that's not why I'm telling you this." She reached into her purse and pulled out a thick manila envelope. "I'm telling you because I need to give you something before I go. Something that belongs to you." Inside the envelope were legal documents, property deeds, investment account statements, and a will that had been recently updated. As I scanned through the papers, a shocking picture emerged. Helen owned significantly more assets than I'd ever realized. The modest house where she'd lived for 40 years was just one property in a portfolio that included rental units across Denver, a small commercial building downtown, and investment accounts worth nearly $2 million. And according to the will, she was leaving everything to me. "Grandma, I can't accept this." "What about Dad?" "What about the family?" Helen's laugh was sharp and bitter. "Your father. The son who visits twice a year and spends both visits asking if I need help managing my finances? The one who brought his wife to my house last week to explain how much they deserved financial support because they're going through a hard time?" The pieces clicked into place. "They asked you for money, too. $50,000 to be precise. The same amount they'd requested from you." Helen shook her head. "Margaret had the audacity to suggest that since I was getting on in years, it would be wise to distribute my assets while I was still alive to see the good they could do." I stared at the legal documents spread across my table. "And you said no." I said more than no. I said that if they couldn't support themselves as grown adults, perhaps they should follow your example and build something instead of expecting handouts. The irony was almost poetic. While my family had been calculating my worth and planning their approach for financial extraction, they'd been running the same calculation on Helen, and she'd seen right through them. "This is too much, Grandma. I've already built my own success. I don't need—" "This isn't about what you need," Helen interrupted gently. "This is about recognition, about ensuring that the person who built something meaningful gets the resources to build something even bigger." Over the following weeks, I spent as much time as possible with Helen. We had dinners at restaurants she'd always wanted to try, took drives through neighborhoods where she'd lived as a young woman, and talked about everything from business strategy to family history I'd never heard before. She told me about my grandfather, who'd built a small construction company from nothing during the 1960s. Apparently, entrepreneurial spirit ran deeper in the family than I'd realized. She shared stories about my father as a young man, ambitious and hardworking before he'd learned to rely on other people's efforts instead of his own. Most importantly, she helped me understand that cutting ties with toxic family members wasn't a failure of character. It was an act of self-preservation that sometimes Required more courage than staying and enduring. Your father was a good boy once, she told me during one of our last conversations. But somewhere along the way, he forgot that respect is earned through actions, not inherited through relationships. Helen passed away on a quiet Tuesday morning in October, surrounded by nurses at the hospice facility where she'd spent her final weeks. I was there, holding her hand as she slipped away peacefully in her sleep. The funeral was small, just me, a few of Helen's longtime friends, and inevitably, my father's family. They sat in the back row of the chapel, whispering among themselves and shooting occasional glances in my direction. After the service, my father approached me in the parking lot. "Alice, I know this isn't the time or place, but we need to discuss Mom's will. There might have been some confusion about her intentions, and—" "There was no confusion," I said quietly. Helen knew exactly what she was doing. Margaret appeared at his shoulder, her expression calculating despite the funeral setting. "Alice, surely you understand that Helen may not have been thinking clearly at the end. The medications, the stress of illness. Are you suggesting my grandmother was mentally incompetent when she updated her will?" I asked, my voice carrying the same authority I'd developed for challenging unethical business practices. The question hung in the air like a dare. Challenging Helen's mental competency would require legal action they couldn't afford, medical evidence they didn't possess, and a level of public scrutiny that would expose their financial desperation to the entire community. My father's shoulders sagged in defeat. "No, of course not." "Good. Then we have nothing to discuss." I walked away from them for the final time, carrying Helen's legacy and the absolute certainty that I'd chosen the right path. 1 year later, I used Helen's inheritance to establish the Brown Foundation for Financial Literacy, a nonprofit organization that provides business training and microloans to people starting their own companies. The foundation's first office opened in the same building where I'd started Brown Financial Services, and our first graduate was a young woman who'd been abandoned by her family and needed someone to believe in her potential. Standing in that office, watching our newest entrepreneur sign the lease for her own small business, I finally understood what Helen had tried to teach me in those final months. A true family isn't defined by shared genetics or legal obligations. True family is found in the people who show up when it matters, who support your growth instead of trying to limit it, and who celebrate your success without calculating what they can extract from it. I'd lost the family I was born into, but I'd gained something far more valuable: the knowledge that I could create my own legacy, my own definition of success, and my own chosen family of people who understood that love is demonstrated through actions, not words. The little girl who once lay broken and abandoned in a hospital bed had become a woman who would never again wait for someone else's permission to matter. But my story didn't end with Helen's death or even with the foundation's establishment. Life has a way of testing your convictions when you least expect it, and mine came 18 months later in the form of an emergency that would challenge everything I'd built. I was reviewing applications for the foundation's third round of grants when Victoria burst into my penthouse office without knocking, something she'd never done in all our years of working together. "Alice, turn on Channel 7 News right now," she said, her face pale with urgency. The headline scrolling across the bottom of the screen made my blood run cold. "Local business owner critical after construction." Accident, the reporter was standing outside Denver General Hospital, the same hospital where my family had abandoned me, describing how Robert Davis had been severely injured when scaffolding collapsed at a job site where he'd been working as a day laborer. My father, reduced to manual labor at 62 years old. The news report continued with details that painted a devastating picture. Margaret's boutique had closed 6 months earlier. Jessica had dropped out of graduate school due to unpaid tuition. My father had taken construction work to help pay their mounting debts, despite having no experience in the field. "The family is requesting prayers and financial assistance for medical expenses," the reporter concluded. "Robert Davis remains in critical condition in the ICU." I sat in stunned silence as the newscast moved on to other stories. Victoria waited beside me, her expression unreadable. "What are you thinking?" she asked quietly. "I'm thinking," I said slowly, "that karma has a twisted sense of humor. The parallels were impossible to ignore. My father is lying in the same hospital where they'd left me. A family facing financial ruin and medical bills they couldn't afford. The same desperation that drives people to reach out to anyone who might help." Over the next 3 days, I found myself checking the hospital's website for updates on his condition. Critical but stable, then serious but improving, finally, stable and conscious. I told myself I was checking out of morbid curiosity, but Victoria saw through my facade immediately. "You're going to visit him, aren't you?" she said during our Thursday morning meeting. "I haven't decided," I replied, though we both knew that wasn't true. "Alice, you don't owe them anything. You made that clear years ago." "I know." I turned to look out at the city, where morning sunlight was reflecting off the glass towers of downtown Denver. But Helen taught me something about the difference between justice and revenge. Maybe seeing him like this isn't about what I owe them. Maybe it's about what I owe myself. That afternoon, I found myself walking through the familiar corridors of Denver General Hospital, past the same nurse's station where Sandy Martinez had once shown me kindness, toward the ICU where my father lay connected to machines that monitored his vital signs. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was voluntarily entering the place where they'd abandoned me, to visit the man who'd walked away when I needed him most. Room 314 was dimly lit, filled with the same steady beeping of monitors I remembered from my own stay. My father looked smaller than I remembered, more fragile, with tubes running from his nose and IV lines threading into both arms. His left leg was elevated in traction, and bandages covered most of his torso. Margaret sat in the bedside chair, looking exhausted and older than her 53 years. She glanced up when I entered, and her expression cycled rapidly through surprise, hope, and something that might have been shame. "Alice," she whispered, "you came." I approached the bed slowly, taking in the reality of my father's condition. According to the chart at the foot of his bed, he had multiple fractures, internal injuries, and a concussion that had left him unconscious for nearly 36 hours. "How is he?" I asked. "Stable, thank God. The doctors say he'll recover, but it's going to take months of physical therapy, and the medical bills." Margaret's voice trailed off. "Are substantial?" I finished. She nodded, tears threatening at the corners of her eyes. "We lost our insurance when the boutique closed. The hospital is talking about payment plans, but even with that, we're looking at hundreds of thousands in debt." I pulled up the second chair and sat down, studying my father's sleeping face. Without the tension and calculation I'd grown accustomed to seeing there, he looked more like the man I remembered from my childhood, the father who'd taught me to ride a bicycle and helped with elementary school math homework. "Where's Jessica?" I asked, working. "She's got 2 part-time jobs now, trying to help with expenses." Margaret wiped her eyes with a tissue. "Alice, I know we have no right to ask anything of you. I know how badly we failed you, how much we hurt you. But you're desperate," I said without malice. "Yes, we're desperate." We sat in silence for several minutes, listening to the rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor and the distant sounds of hospital activity. When my father's eyes finally opened, it took him a moment to focus on my face. "Alice?" His voice was barely audible, rough from the breathing tube they'd recently removed. "Hi, Dad." Tears began flowing down his cheeks. Not the manipulative tears of someone trying to elicit sympathy, but the genuine grief of a man confronting the consequences of his choices. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I'm so sorry for everything. For the hospital, for leaving you alone, for only caring about your success when we needed something from you." The apology I'd waited years to hear felt strange now that it had finally come. Part of me wanted to feel vindicated, triumphant even. Instead, I felt oddly hollow, as if the words had arrived too late to fill the space they'd once occupied in my heart. "I know you are," I said. "Can you ever forgive me?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Forgiveness. The thing Margaret had demanded in my conference room. The thing they'd expected as their right rather than something that needed to be earned. Forgiveness isn't the same as reconciliation, Dad, I said gently. I can forgive you for abandoning me. I can even understand that you were struggling with your own issues and made poor choices. But that doesn't mean we go back to pretending we're a functional family. His face crumpled with disappointment, but also with something that looked like acceptance. I understand, he whispered. Over the next hour, we talked more honestly than we had in years. He told me about the financial pressures that had been building for months, the stress that had driven him to take dangerous work he wasn't qualified for. Margaret admitted that she'd resented my success because it highlighted their failures, and that their attempts to reconnect had been motivated primarily by desperation rather than genuine love. It wasn't the tearful reconciliation you see in movies, where forgiveness magically heals all wounds and families reunite in perfect harmony. It was messier, more complicated, and infinitely more real. When I finally stood to leave, my father reached out and grasped my hand with surprising strength. Alice, I want you to know that I'm proud of you. Not because of your money or your success, but because you became the kind of person who would visit someone who'd hurt you so badly. That takes a strength I never had. I squeezed his hand gently. Get better, Dad. Focus on healing. Outside the hospital, I sat in my car for 20 minutes, processing what had just happened. Victoria called twice, but I let the calls go to voicemail. I needed time to think, to understand what this visit meant and what, if anything, I wanted to do about it. The decision I eventually made surprised even me. 2 weeks later, I established the Davis Family Medical Trust, a fund specifically designed to cover my father's medical expenses and rehabilitation costs. But the trust came with conditions that protected both my boundaries and their dignity. The money would be administered by a third-party trustee, with funds released directly to medical providers and rehabilitation facilities. They would have no direct access to the cash, preventing any possibility of misuse. Most importantly, the trust would cover medical expenses only, not lifestyle costs, debts unrelated to the accident, or any other financial obligations they'd accumulated. I also included a clause requiring that they participate in family financial counseling as a condition of continued support. If they wanted help with this crisis, they needed to demonstrate that they were serious about preventing future ones. When Victoria asked why I'd chosen this approach, I explained it in terms she could understand from our business experience. Sometimes you encounter a failing company that's worth saving, not because of what it is, but because of what it could become with the right intervention, I said. You don't give them unlimited resources or remove all consequences for their poor decisions. You provide targeted support with clear expectations and measurable outcomes. The trust accomplished something I hadn't expected. It allowed me to help them without sacrificing my own well-being or boundaries. I could demonstrate compassion without enabling destructive behavior, show mercy without becoming a victim again. 6 months later, my father had recovered enough to return to work in a role better suited to his age and experience, managing projects rather than performing manual labor. Margaret had enrolled in a business management course and was developing plans for a more sustainable venture. Jessica had returned to school with a clearer understanding of her financial responsibilities. Most importantly, none of them had contacted me directly since the trust was established. They understood that my generosity came with firm boundaries, and that crossing those boundaries would end my support immediately. The Brown Foundation continued to grow, now operating in 3 states and having helped launch over 200 small businesses. We'd partnered with several universities to provide entrepreneurship education, and our microloan program had achieved a repayment rate of 94%, nearly unheard of in the industry. But perhaps the most meaningful development came when one of our foundation's earliest recipients, Maria Santos, approached me with a proposal to establish a subsidiary program focused specifically on helping people who'd been abandoned or rejected by their families. There are so many of us, she explained during our meeting in the foundation's conference room. People who had to build everything from scratch because their families either couldn't or wouldn't support them. They need more than just business training. They need to understand that their worthiness isn't determined by other people's failures. The Family Independence Initiative launched the following year, offering not just financial assistance but also counseling, mentorship, and community building for entrepreneurs who'd overcome family trauma or abandonment. It became our fastest-growing program, serving people whose stories reminded me daily of how far I'd traveled from that broken girl in the hospital bed. Standing in my penthouse one evening, looking out over a city that had become both my proving ground and my home, I reflected on the strange journey that had brought me to this point. I'd started this path seeking nothing more than survival, a way to exist without the family support I'd always taken for granted. Instead, I'd discovered something far more valuable: the ability to create meaning from suffering, to transform rejection into purpose, and to build bridges for others. Trying to cross the same dark waters I'd once navigated. Alone, the little girl who once lay broken and abandoned in a hospital bed had become a woman who would never, again, wait for someone else's permission to matter. But more than that, she'd become someone who could offer that same permission to others. The knowledge that worthiness is inherent, that families can be chosen, and that sometimes the most beautiful lives grow from the harshest soil. And that transformation, I realized, was the greatest inheritance of all. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.